to start by reading again Isaiah 9:6, which is our focal scripture for the whole Advent series, which we'll finish tonight. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So tonight we take up the final lesson, the one for week 4, and it is Prince of Peace. And I have taken this directly from Brueggemann's book, so I'll read through the synopsis that I've given you, and y'all just jump in and ask questions or make comments when you want to. We'll stop and discuss when we feel like it. The fourth title assigned by Isaiah 9:6 to the newly crowned king in Jerusalem is Prince of Peace. It is important to recognize at the outset that the term peace in Prince of Peace is the word shalom, that describes not only an absence of hostility, but the maintenance of a prosperous social system, so that the intent is something like promote the general welfare. Perhaps the quintessential king of peace in the Old Testament is Solomon, for his very name is a play on the word shalom. It is clear, however, that Solomon's policies depended on heavy armaments as well as cheap labor that reflected a willingly coercive policy antithetical to social welfare. Indeed, it turns out that the name Solomon is ironic, for his policies precluded any serious chance for genuine shalom in his realm. The ambiguity of Solomon's practice of peace is quite at variance from the liturgically imagined shalom of Psalm 72. And I'll read just a couple of verses from that psalm. May the mountains yield prosperity for the people, and the hills in righteousness. In his days may righteousness flourish and peace abound until the moon is no more. What do y'all remember about Solomon from the Old Testament?
He was the old splitting the baby in half.
Splitting the baby in half. He was known as the wisest king. He asked for wisdom instead of prosperity for himself or for his kingdom. He asked for wisdom in ruling the people. So he was known as this wise king. And so the famous story is two mothers both insist that the baby is theirs. And he said, well, just cut the baby in half and give each woman half of the baby. And the real mother said, no, let her have it. And so he said, now we know who the real mother is, and the baby goes to that woman. I didn't remember that Solomon's peace depended on heavy armament. It makes sense. That's just not what I remember learning about Solomon and his reign when I was a child. But I remember his wisdom. But apparently, Brueggemann, who is an Old Testament Hebrew scriptures scholar, says that Solomon's peace was coercive, that he had a big army. He could not just promote peace, he could insist on peace because he had an army to enforce it. So that it was a coercive policy, antithetical to social welfare. So we're going to not talk so much about Solomon as we go through here, but we're going to talk more about peace and what kind of peace. If it is a peace that is mandated and enforced by an army, that's not the same as the kind of peace that, say, Jesus taught. So we're going to be looking at more than one kind of peace as we go through tonight. Here in ancient Israel's liturgic imagination, the premise of peace is the practice of justice for the poor and needy. And that anticipated peace includes a more general prosperity for the people. That is, not just for the urban elites clustered around the king. You may have heard anytime this year, that our economy is going gangbusters. Yes, the stock market has looked real good this year, and people who had money made more money. But because of inflation, especially the past 2 years, people who don't have a lot of money and who don't have money to invest in the stock market are barely keeping their heads above water.
Right.
So it may look like a prosperous economy for a certain class of person and not so prosperous for another class of person. And that has always been true. In any kind of economy, there were those who had and those who didn't have so much. And policies of a king had a lot to do with who was going to get better. Who was going to have the opportunity to improve their station in life, and who wasn't. So that same ambiguity about peace is reflected in the awaited disarmament that is a prerequisite for shalom. So Brueggemann is taking a stand here and saying the word shalom in the Hebrew language didn't refer to the kind of oppressive peace that Solomon might have practiced with his policies, where he enforced peace, where he didn't allow any enemies to disrupt the peace of his land, because he was so well armed that he could afford to keep the enemies back. Let's see. Clearly, as long as there are armaments, peace will at most be a restless, unstable possibility. And this was true in Israel, because if you remember, the prosperity of Solomon's reign did not last very long after Solomon's reign. It was only in the next generation that the kingdom split into two parts, and each had to elect their own king. So Solomon was the last king of what we call the United Kingdom, and then there was a split. Well, neither of the splits was as prosperous and well-to-do as the United Kingdom under Solomon. And
was the split still considered both Israel
and Judah?
Oh, okay,
so the northernmost tribes became the nation of Israel and had to put a king on the throne, and then the southern tribes were called Judah, and they had their own king. So things went downhill after Solomon. They were not so prosperous. And can't you just imagine those enemies that Solomon's reign kept at bay? They were looking for an opportunity to get in and get at some of the riches of the kingdoms. And so when they were weakened, they were more vulnerable then to conquerors, and eventually over the next several hundreds of years, both the northern kingdom fell to conquerors, and then the southern kingdom fell to conquerors. And they no longer could put their own kings on the throne. Their conquerors told them who would rule them. Brueggemann is saying, look, that kind of peace, it doesn't last, because it's not a stable peace. In response to Torah instruction, those who hold arms in a real peace, in a real shalom, will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and they shall not learn war anymore. He's talking about the kind of peace where people willingly lay down their arms and burn them up in the fire, or remake them into something more useful, like plowshares and pruning hooks.
That would feed the people, or that would do
or that would make them productive.
Okay.
So instead of being defensive, now they are tools of productivity. They can farm their land, they can sell their produce, they can give produce away to the poor. They can let the poor of the land come and glean in their fields. So, but the main point is that it's a peace where people choose to lay down their arms. And that's what makes for real shalom, the ideal of this overarching peace. Elsewhere, however, disarmament is itself coercive activity enforced by the victor who eliminates the arms of the losing adversary. In Isaiah's oracle, in chapter 9 of Isaiah that we've been looking at, disarmament is an act of violent imposition. And he takes that from this verse. For all the boots of the tramping warriors and all the garments rolled in blood shall be burned as fuel for the fire. The way that he's interpreting this verse is that it isn't Israel's arms that are being burned, it's their adversaries, because they have disarmed their enemies and they're burning their enemies' weapons. So again, he's saying that this is a disarmament by an act of violent imposition. So whoever wins gets to say who doesn't get to hold arms. So if you're on the losing end, you lose your arms. You know, your army is destroyed, your weapons are taken, and so forth. Since this is in the oracle that anticipates the king as a prince of peace, it is likely that the anticipated prince of peace will be a victor who can impose disarmament on his adversaries. So it's knowing this and seeing this in the Isaiah oracle kind of makes it ironic that that Christians would ever adopt this to talk about Jesus, because this is clearly not the kind of peace that Jesus would have imagined or taught or hoped for. This kind of imposition of peace, this I conquered you, so now my kingdom is going to have peace because none of you can have weapons anymore. You won't be a threat to us anymore because we're going to oppress you and keep you back so that you can't threaten us anymore.
But isn't that kind of what the Jewish people were hoping the Messiah was going to be originally? Was this
some of them
conqueror
did.
that would lead them away from Rome? And
Yes, and who would even defeat Rome, right. Which, you know, kind of thinking about that today, that was kind of ludicrous because the Roman Empire was such an untouchable power in the first century. But that was kind of what they were thinking. They didn't get that kind of Messiah. So, in Jesus anyway. So this is not a peace made by negotiation or reconciliation. It is rather an imposition by the winner. It turns out that peace makes a better political slogan than a credible political reality. Thus Jeremiah, different prophet, can attest to the dishonesty that operates when such slogans provide cover for policies that are sure to result in acute social conflict and social destabilization. And this comes from the book of Jeremiah. For the least to the greatest of them, everyone is greedy for unjust gain. And from prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. They have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. So Jeremiah was pointing out the hypocrisy of a kingdom, a regime that is saying we're the party for peace when their policies were clearly oppressive, violent, dependent on military might and such as that. It was a rare occasion in ancient Israel when the political realities coincided with exalted religious liturgical cadences. But the rhetoric of peace serves an important function in keeping available a vision of an alternative society in an alternative world. The tradition of Jeremiah could anticipate such a possibility grounded in forgiveness. So while the people who were making political policies dealt with political and historical realities, like, well, we're not going to be free from the threat from possible invader B over there unless we have a strong military presence on our border. So that may be the political reality, while the priests and the prophets are preaching peace. We must have shalom. We must have justice and prosperity for all our people. Yes, that is their hope and their dream, but it is very rarely the political reality in Israel. But the idea of it, a possibility grounded in forgiveness, the idea of it lived on from generation to generation to generation. The tradition of Ezekiel, now we're bringing in yet another prophet, can anticipate a covenant of peace that will be counter to the conventional exploitative coercion of the city. And this is from Ezekiel 34, which we looked at last week and the year before. I will make with them a covenant of peace and banish wild animals from the land, so that they may live in the wild and sleep in the woods securely. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will bless them and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary among them forever. So these are words of God in Ezekiel 34, where God has been, in this chapter, criticizing the kings, and he has used the metaphor of shepherds and said, you've not been good shepherds of my sheep, you've been bad shepherds of my sheep, because you've taken the wool for yourselves, and you've taken the food for yourselves, and you've not fed the sheep and clothed the sheep and gathered the sheep. Well, he was talking about the people. He was saying to the kings, you've not been good kings because you have not cared for my people. So I'm just going to replace you. I'm going to take all authority away from you, and I'm going to be the king of my people, and I will bring them peace. So says Ezekiel. These visions look beyond shabby historical reality. These old utterances reiterated possibilities against the facts on the ground. The facts on the ground were the politics, You got to have an army. You've got to have a well-stocked army. You've got to collect taxes from the people so that you can fund the army, and so forth and so forth. In the Christian tradition, it is expected and confessed that in Jesus of Nazareth, the contradiction of reality and vision will be overcome. So we've been talking about the reality is this political reality that you can't have peace and protect your people unless you have military might. And this, what did he call it? I got to figure out my other hand. Okay, the vision, the vision of peace against this reality. And so if there is a contradiction in the Hebrew scriptures, then in the Christian tradition, we say that Christ resolves this contradiction and shows us how we can be a peaceful society without coercion and oppression. So back to this sentence. In Jesus of Nazareth, the contradiction of reality and vision will be overcome as Jesus fulfills the mandate of Prince of Peace. That is, the Son of the King, God being the King now, Jesus being the Son of the King, whose responsibility and possibility is to bring peace. But Jesus isn't going to even suggest that we do it the way Solomon did it or the way the other kings did it. Jesus will bring this idea of peace that is counter to political power. Whatever claim Jesus has to being a prince, political, not biological, he is no prince that was expected, for his notion of governance clearly contradicted the ways of governance in the empire of Rome. Because Rome put in strong leaders that oppressed the people and made it hard for them to have any power, any kind of power that would mean that they were a threat to the power of Rome.
It's like they kept the peace.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, you've heard of peacekeepers, a peacekeeping force, and they're men with guns.
Yeah.
Okay. That was the kind of the peace that is that the empire's idea of peace. The peace that Jesus will initiate and sponsor, a peace that passes all human understanding and that defies all ordinary expectations, will be a peace that is wrought in vulnerability, that does not seek to impose its own way. Peace via vulnerability confounds the empire! ! So he's the author, Brueggemann, is getting ready to tell us more about the kind of peace that Jesus taught and how very different it is from the empire's idea of what it takes to keep peace among an oppressed people. Jesus does not flinch from the agenda of peace, only insisting that the peace he will enact cannot be received, interpreted, or understood in any normal category, that is, the categories of the empire. So we're going to talk more about when Jesus was before Pilate. Jesus went before Herod and was tried among the Jews, but then they said, no, we're going to take him to Pilate. So they took him to Pilate. Well, Pilate had a hard time even communicating with Jesus. And even though they were speaking probably the same language, probably they were both speaking Greek. They were communicating in Greek, or maybe Aramaic. We don't know exactly. But it doesn't say that there was an interpreter there, interpreting between them. So technically they were speaking the same language, but their understanding of, say, what it would take to create a peaceful society was so different that they couldn't, the end of their conversation is when Jesus says something about truth, and Pilate says, what is truth? Because they would never have even been able to agree on what truth was. They came from such different points of view. So Jesus was going to challenge this normal understanding of what it took to create a prosperous and peaceful society. In the Bethlehem story of Jesus' birth, the messengers, the angels, the word angel means messenger, makes clear that this is no conventional birth and no conventional king. This is rather an agent of God's peace who will defy all usual categories. Jesus wasn't born in a palace. Jesus was born in a stable. Jesus wasn't placed immediately on a throne, a baby throne. He was placed in a feed bin among where the animals ate. And yet we in the Christian tradition called him a king, and even a king at birth, but he certainly didn't look like a king at birth. There was nothing about his circumstances that would have led a casual observer to say, oh, this is your king. Other than that, maybe those gifts that the wise men brought. They were kingly gifts. But other than that, it was not a usual set of circumstances for the birth of a king. The ministry of Jesus, with its narratives of miraculous transformations, concerns the restoration of the healthy order of creation. In his blessing, as he dismissed transformed persons, the utterance of peace is much more than a simple goodbye, a way of saying, goodbye, go in peace. Jesus meant much more than that. It is, in fact, a recognition that the shalom order of creation has, in this particular case, been restored. It almost makes me think, because of the language that he uses here, it's as if every human child born is born into health. Now, we know that that's not precisely true, because some children are born into disability, born without one arm, or born blind, or born deaf. But most children are born healthy. And so he's implying that we are all born into this shalom health. And that as we live our lives, we become misshapen, broken, harmed, ill, diseased. And that when Jesus healed the blind, healed the sick, healed the crippled, he restored them to their original health. He restored them to well-being. So it was almost like in that particular person's case, Jesus restored the peace of creation because he restored their health. It meant that they could go out and work. Well, for the men, they could go out and work and earn a wage to support their families, to feed their children. If they had been kicked out of their home because they couldn't provide for their families, they could go home. If they'd been kicked out of their home because they suffered from leprosy, they could go home and be reunited with their loved ones. And for women, maybe it meant that they could bear children. Maybe it meant that they could become married, or maybe it meant that they could go home and take care of the children that they had if he freed them from disease or bodily disfigurement. And he did heal some women from disfigurement. As Jesus himself wrought shalom, he wrought peace in people's lives, kind of one person at a time. So he anticipated that his disciples would enact peace among those to whom they carried the gospel. The disciples are to come in peace and find those who share in peace. This comes from the scripture when Jesus is sending out his disciples to go into the towns, and he gives them instructions about how to go. Don't take an extra cloak and don't take an extra pair of sandals, but stay with whomever, will give you shelter. And Jesus is giving them all these instructions, and he tells them that they are to go in peace, and then to look for people who will invite them in peace and share in peace. It's almost like go to those who you deem will be hospitable to you, and then bless them with your hospitality, so that you can then, be on your mission of carrying the gospel, the good news, healing people, and even driving out evil spirits. That's what they thought made people unwell. And the disciples were able to do that. So when Jesus was talking about this peace, this shalom, it's as if he's telling them to do just what he's been doing. Go to one person and find a way to restore that person's well-being. And then you have brought peace to that person, maybe to a household. And we know that one good turn leads to another, and very often you can start a movement with just one very unselfish act that inspires someone else to do something or to give of themselves.
Which would have kind of been like the total opposite of a king going in, and the way they get peace is to subjugate everybody, and everybody hates them, but they're going to be silent. It's not going to spread. It's
Yes, it's ultimately going to make them resentful, and if they ever do get any power, let's say they join together, they may try to start a revolution, a mutiny. So it's an unstable peace, is what Brueggemann said, when it's something that is imposed on a people. It's like, we're not going to give you any choice but to live in peace, because we're going to make sure that you don't have the power to do anything else. Let's see. These words suggest that peace is a quite specific, personal, interpersonal transaction, so that the peace extended by the disciples is a people-to-people happening that lies beyond the conventions of imperial expectation. Imagine one of Jesus' disciples coming to your door, and he's dressed very simply. There are two together because Jesus sent them out 2 by 2 so that they would not be alone. And you open the door and they say, "We come in peace. Can you offer us a meal?" They're not there to impose themselves or their policies. It would be very different than the 2 soldiers showing up at your door. You might only invite the soldiers in if you felt like you weren't going to live through tonight if you didn't. But Jesus' disciples didn't show up like that. They weren't there to impose any kind of rule on the people. They said, "We're here to give you good news, to tell you something that you don't know about, to offer you something, to offer you healing, to offer peace to your family, to your household. If we can be of service to you, we will be." See how very different that is than a soldier with a sword showing up at the door, which is probably what the Roman Empire would have done if they wanted to, come in and collect your taxes. You might have had a Roman soldier show up at your door with a sword saying, "Pay me or else." Okay, let's flip over to this is the last page. Jesus wept over the city of Jerusalem because he knows that the city will be crushed. But the prelude to this anticipation is an acknowledgement that it could have been otherwise. And I didn't bring my Bible down here to read that, but I'll describe it to you. The possibility of otherwise depends on knowing the things that make for peace. Remember, Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, and he pauses outside the city, and he's looking over the city, and he weeps because he knows what is in store for the city of Jerusalem. He knows that they're going to be conquered, and that much of the city will be destroyed, and that people will die. And so he weeps, but he says, "It didn't have to be this way. I tried to gather you to me the way a hen gathers her baby chicks under her wings." And if you know anything about chickens, you know that the hen gathers her chick and covers them to protect them. She actually makes them invisible because they hide under her feathers so that someone looking on wouldn't even necessarily know that they're looking at chicks being hidden. And that's what Jesus wanted to do for Jerusalem, and Jerusalem wouldn't allow him to do that. He could not gather them because they refused to be gathered. The possibility of otherwise depends on knowing the things that make for peace. So here are the bulleted items. And Brueggemann says, peace requires, number one, the capacity to forgive. Think about, maybe there's nobody you would call an enemy, but think about someone that you have had a falling out with, and you're not speaking to, and they're not speaking to you, and they probably say things to their friends about you that you wouldn't want to hear because they're not favorable to you. They're critical of you. And you do the same thing when you refer to that person. Okay? Jesus said that we have to be willing to forgive each other and be reconciled with each other in order to move on together. Otherwise, our disputes will keep pulling us apart. And boy, I think that's true in our country today. And I referred this morning to the dispute over slavery. It kept pulling people apart. It began in the late 1850s and right around 1860. It was dangerous to be neutral in this country about the issue of slavery because the pro and the con wanted you to get on one side of the fence or the other.
Pick a side.
Yeah, pick a side. You need to declare, because I don't know that I trust you if you're not going to declare. And if you declare for them, you better find your way to the other side of the Mason-Dixon line, because you may not be safe here. And it had become that divided. And Jesus says, as long as we're not willing to forgive, our disputes will continue to divide us and make peace more and more impossible or improbable. Peace requires, number two, a readiness to share generously, being open-handed instead of tight-fisted. The violation of strict class stratification in society. Meaning, we talked about hierarchies and about how some people are born into prosperity. Let's say you were born into, the family. You were born into the Kennedy family in, 1962. Well, they were very prosperous, very well known, American royalty, and had a great deal of power. And then, say, another child was born at the same time in southern Mississippi in black skin. Those two people are not going to have the same experience in life. They're not going to have the same challenges in life. They're not going to have the same view of life, or even the view of our country or our country's opportunities, because their points of view are going to be very, very different. So Brueggemann is saying peace requires that we break down these barriers between people so that the poor child born in South Mississippi has equal opportunities with one born in prosperous Massachusetts society. Number four, an attentiveness to the vulnerable and the unproductive. Boy, that word unproductive hit me hard. Because I think of the gaffe that was caught on a recording. It was Romney. Do y'all remember Mitt Romney saying, somebody asking him about the 49%, was it 47% or 49%? And he said, they don't count. You remember? He was running for president.
Yeah,
And he was in a big crowd. And somebody, ask him a question. What about the 47% of people who are living on the government dole? And he said, they don't count. And boy, that got played everywhere. And people had plenty to say, about we don't count, we don't vote. Oh yes, we do. We do vote, and we do count. And the vulnerable. Who do you consider vulnerable in our society? What kind of people?
I mean, you could go back to the class that you were talking about before. I mean, anybody that's kind of doesn't have power or wealth would be vulnerable, as well as health issues, mental and physical.
People who've spent all their money on medical bills and have nothing left, left to sell, no home left because, they've sold everything to try to make maybe the father well so that he could go back to work and earn a living to support the rest of them. But there's lots of things that make people vulnerable. Your skin color, your national origin. If you look like a foreigner in this country, if you look like you came from the Middle East, if you look like you might have been born Muslim, you're going to be more vulnerable in this society than the majority. A child with a disability, whether it's mental or physical, certainly more vulnerable, is typically going to have less power as an adult, less chance of really becoming successful and productive in life. And finally, humility in the face of exaltation, being last among those who insist on being first and denying self in the interest of neighbor. Certainly Jesus, is like king of that category. But can you think of other people who have lived a life that is in agreement with this description? Humility in the face of exaltation, being last among those who insist on being first, denying self in the interest of neighbor.
I think of St. Francis of Assisi.
Yeah.
I have a painting of him on my wall in my bedroom. Up there.
Oh.
With a bunch of animals. But I have one of his quotes on there too. And it says, "For it is in giving that we receive."
And the current Pope, who took the name Francis, I think he was the first Pope to take that name, and did it because he intended to be a leader who walked in humility and led in humility. And I think he has for the most part. And I really respect that because Pope is a pretty powerful position, an exalted position. But Pope Francis has said, no, I'm just the humble guy from, was it Buenos Aires that he was before, and he ministered among the poor and the outcasts of society. And then when he became Pope, it was like, well, I'm not going to change. I'm still going to be the man I was, working on the margins and ministering to people who have needs. I think of Martin Luther King Jr. Certainly there were people who wanted to exalt him and put him on a pedestal, and I think he resisted that and said, I'm just a voice.
I think if he was still alive, he wouldn't have allowed the monument to be built.
Possibly. Another one is George Washington. Was it in this group that I talked about George Washington several weeks ago? That when he was elected,
Like he didn't want to be king. He didn't want to have those powers.
he didn't want to have a title that implied exaltation, like king. And so he took a lowly title, president, which at that time, nobody wanted the title president because it didn't have a lot of power to it. A president is simply one who presides over a meeting. And so he took a lowly title, and over 250 years, it has become an exalted title. It's become a very powerful title. But he took it because it wasn't powerful. He took it because it was humble. And I believe that he insisted that he would not be reelected over and over again. That he said, no, once I've served my term, then someone else will be elected. I think that takes humility to choose that. But when our government was fully formed, they wrote that into the government so that other leaders who got up there, even if they were tempted to stay, would have to step down, and so that limits were put on. I think at one time, it was 3 terms, and then it was cut back to just 2. But I think
because didn't
one of the Roosevelts served, or it began
in
a
his
third,
third term when he passed.
and then they changed it. So, this humility in the face of exaltation. That's when someone wants to exalt you, and you say, no, I'm just a regular person with something important to say. Jesus was that way. I'm just a regular person with something important to say. I think that's one of the reasons he called himself Son of Man. I think it was a title of humility, and that's what he chose for himself, a title of humility and not one of power.
And I can't name anybody famous, but I think I can think of so many people in this church that fit this, that are the ones that, are the last in line for fellowship, or the ones that are doing all this stuff with the deacons or cleaning up this, there's so many people. And in other churches I've been to, it's not always been that way.
Yeah.
Like people are voting. They're hoping to get that Sunday School of the Year teacher award, or it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
But I think this really fits a lot of people within our congregation.
Yeah. I remember when I first came here in 2004 and began to get to know people, and I was shocked that I was sitting beside people who were rocket scientists and doctor of this and doctor of that, and well known in their field, and a hero in their field, and that people would recognize their names if I, drove down to Atlanta and started throwing out names. Oh, I go to church with so and so and so and so, and they would be like, "Oh, wow, you go to church with that person," and they were just all through the congregation and as humble as anybody sitting in the pews. And says all these are practices that mark Jesus' presence in his society. So Jesus' person, but also Jesus' influence, because he taught his disciples to be this. And they taught other followers of Jesus to be this. And 2,000 years later, we're still learning from Jesus to be this. Learning what it means that the first will be last and the last will be first. Teaching our children that. Of course, the empire, in its refusal of the things that make for peace, generates a society of hostility, aggression, greed, conflict, and violence. It is no wonder that when Jesus stood before the Roman governor, Pilate had no categories through which to understand him, because, as Jesus is remembered as saying, "My kingdom is not from this world." That is not derived from fearful aggression. Jesus wasn't going to be the kind of king who would put himself above others and say, "Call me king." He just wasn't going to be. And Pilate couldn't imagine any other kind of king. In the fourth gospel, Jesus says to his disciples, "Peace be with you. Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." The formulation indicates beyond shalom as a conventional greeting that Jesus' mission from God is peace. Peace that unifies the way the world is organized. We are drawn to confess Jesus as Prince of Peace. We do so, however, in the awareness that this is no normal peace. The peace he brings is dangerous, subversive, and a contradiction of all that is usual. Advent is a freighted time in which to acknowledge that what we anticipate in the prophetic oracle of Isaiah deeply contradicts the expectation of ancient Israel. It deeply contradicts the expectation of those who trusted the Roman Empire, trusted the Jews, and trusted others. It overrides the expectations of our society, which awaits a peacemaker who will ensure our advantage in the world. Let's stop and talk about that for a minute. The United States has been the greatest country in the world for, I know, at least a century, more than a century, probably at least a century, maybe a little bit more. We grew up here. We grew up learning that the United States is the best country in the world. We were taught that. The most powerful country in the world. How are we going to take it, Americans, when some other country becomes the most powerful country in the world and we slip to second place or fifth place? What's that going to be like for us?
Well, and we might be the most powerful, but we're not like
The best.
We're not the best.
We're not the happiest.
You know, we're not the happiest. We're not the most,
We're not-
green country.
Yeah, that's right.
You can look at things that other countries are doing, and it's like, why aren't we doing that?
Yeah.
I mean, we're still the world. It's us and China for gas emissions and they call them to the global warming and everything. So, I mean, the best is.
It's according to how you define
Yeah,
the best.
how do you define it? We've got more missiles. We've got more
yeah,
things that can blow
yeah,
people up.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have the power to impose peace, to send peacekeeping forces with guns, into foreign countries. But go back to the top of the page, what peace requires. You read through these and you think about what our lawmakers in Washington are dealing with political realities across the world, and you still see this contradiction between the kind of peace that is imposed at the barrel of a gun and the kind of peace that Jesus insisted is possible.
Look how it has made those guns be used for a lot of wrong things. I can't believe we've gone through so many awful things in my lifetime. I've seen good and I've seen too much bad in the last few years. Just all of a sudden, it's like we have no thought for no one or anything.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what my thought was about in church today. We come up on something you said, but I don't remember that either. But I thought, this is making me think of what's going on in the war across the way, and how God's people are going through it. Here it is again, almost worse, because it's been doing so openly. And it was bad enough when it was lied about in World War II.
Yeah.
So,
Most of the world didn't know what was going on
Right.
in Germany during World War II.
they didn't believe it until
But
they
our
had some.
eyes were opened when our troops walked in and our own relatives, people we knew saw with their own eyes
What was going on.
what was going on.
But it made me think something that was said made me think about them awful hard right there in church. Because I grew up in 2 towns that had lots of Jewish people in them. And I had nothing against them. And my mom used to say things I didn't like to hear.
Yeah. Critical things.
Not that I'm not perfect, because I know I've not been very good lately myself. But I know I get angry about things I can't do anything about anymore.
Yeah.
It hasn't got anything to do with other people. It's got to do with me personally.
I'm saddened by the things that are going on in the world, and I wonder what it's going to take to turn us around, so that we start, as Americans at least, pulling together, or as Christians. If there was a Christian movement that said, let's pull together, let's overcome our differences so that we can make a positive difference in our very violent world. What would it take to do that? And I don't know. But
do you think that is something that will happen actually on earth, or is it more of a striving to get your own inner peace? The peace of Christ is to try to live this way, knowing that the world's really not going to be this way.
I think it will always be a battle against those in the world who believe in power by might. They believe in weapons and defending what they have, and you're not going to take it from me, and I can defend it, and that goes against like this a readiness to share generously. That's very different. But I still think that Christianity can be a force for good in this world. But I don't think we are going to make it until we can reconcile the differences within our own religion. There's so many different kinds of Christians out there right now. And we don't see things the same way, and we don't particularly like each other, and we wouldn't refer to each other as like-minded. We probably would not be able to agree if you brought a Bible out here and we just pulled out one verse. We're probably going to read it in 2 very different ways, and I think that's what we Christians have got to overcome. I think we've got to do more than talk about reconciliation with our neighbor in American Christianity. And if we can overcome our differences, then I think we can be a force for good in the world again. I think American Christianity has already been a force for good in the world, but we're not right now. But I think we could be again, but it's going to take a lot to get us there. So, I've read everything but the last sentence. The Christ child who is born, coronated, and worshipped is innocent, but he is not innocuous. I had to look it up. Innocuous means not harmful or offensive. So, if you wanted to be a part of a peace march outside of a I know people used to go down to the one in Columbus, outside of Columbus. What's the name of the military, the army base outside of Columbus? Can't think of it. But Christians used to go down there, and they would protest, march outside the gates and protest what was going on behind the walls and the fences of that installation. And if I were to do that, and I was saying, peace requires the capacity to forgive, peace requires a readiness to share generously, and I'm reading through this list, they're going to take offense at me. They're going to take offense at my presence there. They are probably going to take offense at my words.
Both sides would.
Well, I'm thinking about the people who are listening to me across the, gate or whatever. They're going to take offense at probably my naivete and my insistence that I have something to say to them. So Jesus was offensive in this way to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the priests and the scribes and the power, the power structure, because he was saying things that were not in agreement with their policies, and so they took offense. So
that's what made him end up on the cross.
Exactly. He made enemies.
But he knew that was going to happen.
Yes.
He knew that was something he had to do. But something about his human part of him, he wasn't afraid, I don't think. He was sorrowful that they couldn't understand what they need to do.
He was probably sorrowful that that's what it was going to take. But
it really made him cry about his own people.
Yeah.
And I remember when we had Jews for Jesus come to church in Indiana, and that made me feel good. But I'm not sure, Martha. The little sign I put underneath the Good Shepherd in the kitchen?
Talking about El Shaddai?
Yeah. Well, almost the word she said made me think of that.
Shalom.
Yeah.
Okay. So, there's more than one kind of peace. So we've learned that from Brueggemann, and the kind of peace that Isaiah wrote about, what he recorded about King Hezekiah, that Hezekiah was, they were shouting, Prince of Peace. They were probably talking about an imposed peace where they would be the victor and they would be able to impose on the conquered, you will not raise up weapons against us because we are more powerful than you. That's the kind of Prince of Peace they were probably talking about. That's not the kind of Prince of Peace that Jesus is. So there's this contradiction. So
if he hadn't have been the way he was, he would have never been able to save us all from sin.
yeah, and he wouldn't have had the influence.
Oh, it just hurt me one time when somebody talked about somebody that had done something awful.
Yeah.
And they said, well, they'll be in hell when they die. And I said, but not if they gave in to Jesus and asked for his forgiveness for what they had done. That wouldn't keep them out of heaven because they finally found the truth.
There's a chance for forgiveness.
Right. So that's what nobody believes in anymore. When I think about, it wasn't my hometown was Hampton, but the city next to it was Newport News. And when Newport News, Virginia got put on the news where the 6-year-old boy shot his teacher, I don't think she died though, but she, was maimed from it. That was awful. To think a 6-year-old child was acting like a man in the, army with a gun.
Yeah.
I just couldn't fathom it. And he called her a naughty name.
Oh. Called her a naughty name and shot her, and he was only 6. What are we teaching our children?
Well, not the right stuff, that's for sure. Or somewhere somebody stuck in some wrong teaching.
Yeah.
So Teresa, looking over the 4 weeks, would you say that the names all sort of had a little, to me, they all had a little bit of a contradiction to what we kind of would think they would mean?
A little bit
Is
of
that kind
irony.
of Brueggemann, is that the author's
I think so.
overall thought process, is just to look at these names differently when we listen to the Messiah, when
Yeah.
we hear it? Okay.
What's so unusual about Jesus? He loved everybody, even if they weren't a lovable person.
Yeah. He loved the unlovable.
Right. And that's what got him up on the cross. That's what made him find something they could get rid of him for, because they didn't like what he kept saying.
Yeah.
To know that God's first thing, the thing I used to ask so much was, how did we learn to love? And it took me years to find the verse that said, because he loved us first,
Yeah.
we understand love because of that. So, something so simple, it took me a long time to find. And you know the verse, because we looked it up one day when she was at the house. And it was amazed me what you told me about all the stuff I had underlined. That it was the first thing she preached about.
Yeah. My very first sermon when I was 17. The text was 1 John 4:7, which ends, "For God is love."
Yeah.
And she had opened her Bible to it and showed me the underlined passages.
And then there was the whole chapter before it and after it. It
About
was
love.
2 whole chapters practically that I underlined most of it with red. So it was something that woke me up a big way that day. I found that. And that was one I didn't have somebody find it for me. I just come onto it by reading. So I had tried to find the verse about what gives us the thing for Trinity. And I can't find it because I couldn't see, and I didn't have this out, or I would have been looking a little better.
Well, next time I come to your house, we'll hunt for it.
I don't have it marked.
I'll find it and you
A
can
lot
mark
of
it.
times I would do this, and that's because I used that in a lesson for Sunday school.
No. I hope you find it. But thank you all for being here. Mary, did you think we were going to start at 6?
Yes,
We started at 5.
that's what I gathered. But I'm glad I got here for the end. That's for